I was holding a glass of Prosecco in my sister's backyard in Sacramento, California, surrounded by 40 of her closest friends and family, when my father stood up with a microphone someone had rented for the occasion and decided that the best way to toast his younger daughter's 35th birthday was to spend 4 minutes explaining why I had always been the disappointing one. He didn't use those words exactly. He was too practiced for that. But everyone there understood exactly what he meant. And I stood there smiling with my jaw clenched so tight it ached for 2 days afterward. That wasn't even the worst part. The worst part came 40 minutes later, when my husband stood up, asked to borrow the microphone, and very calmly said something that changed the entire trajectory of my relationship with my father. My name is Renata Castellano. I'm 38 years old. I'm a structural engineer at a firm in Sacramento that handles seismic retrofitting for commercial buildings. And I've spent my career being the kind of person who double-checks calculations until I'm certain, because in my line of work, being almost right isn't good enough. I mention this because it matters later. My father, Vittorio Castellano, was 67 that summer, retired from a 31-year career running a small but successful commercial flooring company in Stockton, and he had never once in my entire adult life attended one of my professional milestones without finding a way to redirect the conversation toward my sister. My sister Bianca was turning 35. She's 3 years younger than me. And the easy summary of our family dynamic, the one I told myself for most of my life, was that Bianca was the favorite. But that summary is too simple. And it took me a long time and a lot of uncomfortable honesty to understand the more complicated version underneath it. Bianca had married into money. Her husband, Connor Ashworth, came from a family with a winery in Napa and a portfolio I genuinely don't know the size of, but enough that Bianca hadn't worked since their wedding 6 years earlier. Enough that they had a house in St. Helena worth somewhere north of $3 million. Enough that my father, who had spent 31 years laying commercial flooring with his own hands and counting every dollar twice, had developed something that looked like reverence whenever Connor's name came up. My husband, Marcus Webb, different family, no relation to anyone else named Marcus you might have heard about, was a high school physics teacher, 41 years old, taught at Sacramento's Luther Burbank High School for 14 years, made $78,000 a year, drove a 2016 Honda Accord with 130,000 miles on it that he kept meticulously maintained because he believed in taking care of what you had rather than replacing it. We'd been married 9 years. We owned a modest 3-bedroom house in the Pocket neighborhood that we'd bought in 2019 for $410,000, and between my salary and his, we lived comfortably but not extravagantly. My father had never said in words that he respected Connor's wealth more than he respected my husband's profession, but he didn't need to say it. He'd say things like, Connor flew the whole family to Tuscany for 2 weeks. Can you imagine? At family dinners where Marcus and I were sitting right there, having taken our most recent vacation to a state park 3 hours away. Because that's what our budget allowed, and we were happy with it. He'd ask me almost every time we spoke how Marcus's summer plans were going, in a tone that implied teaching was a part-time hobby rather than a profession that shaped 400 teenagers a year. What my father didn't know, what almost no one in my family knew, was that 14 months before Bianca's birthday party, my husband and I had started a side business. Marcus had always been gifted at building things. He'd spent years constructing elaborate physics, demonstration equipment for his classroom, trebuchets and pendulum systems, and scale models that other teachers across the district started requesting for their own classrooms. In 2022, almost by accident, he'd started selling laser-cut educational science kits through an online store. I'd handled the engineering specs and the structural design work in my evenings. By the time of Bianca's party, the business, we called it Pendulum Labs, was doing $34,000 a month in revenue with margins around 40%, which meant we were netting somewhere around $13,500 a month in profit on top of our regular salaries. We hadn't told anyone, not because we were hiding it dramatically, but because Marcus is a private person about money, and I had learned somewhere along the way that sharing good news with my father tended to get filtered through a lens of comparison to Bianca and Connor, and I'd grown tired of that lens. So we kept it quiet, kept building, kept saving, We had just put a deposit down on a small commercial unit to expand production. We were, by any reasonable measure, doing extremely well. My father had no idea. The party was on a Saturday in June, in Bianca and Connor's backyard, which had a stone patio and an outdoor kitchen and a pool with one of those infinity edges that makes the water look like it's spilling into the hills beyond it. There were string lights and a catering company and a 3-tier cake from a bakery in Yountville. My father had clearly had a few glasses of wine by the time he stood up with the microphone around 8 o'clock, the sky just starting to go orange behind the vineyard rows in the distance. He started warmly enough. He talked about Bianca as a little girl, about her stubbornness, about how proud he was of the woman she'd become. Then he said, and I have to say, watching Bianca build this life with Connor, this beautiful home, this family she's creating, it makes a father feel like he did something right. That was fine. That was a normal thing for a father to say. But then he kept going. You know, I think about how different my daughters turned out, he said, and I felt my stomach tighten because I knew, with the particular dread of someone who has heard this speech in slightly different forms, many times before, exactly where this was going. Bianca always knew what she wanted. She knew how to take care of herself, how to find someone who could give her a good life. Renata. He gestured toward me with the hand holding his wine glass, and 40 people turned to look at me. Renata always did things the hard way, always so stubborn about it, working so hard for what exactly? He laughed a little, like it was affectionate, like it wasn't a knife. I used to worry about her. Still do, honestly. A teacher's salary, that little house. I just want my girls taken care of, you know? I want to tell you I had some dignified response in that moment. But the truth is I just stood there, smiling the way you smile when you're trying to signal to a room full of people that you're fine, while something in my chest folded in on itself. I'd heard variations of this for years. I'd heard it at Christmas, at my mother's memorial 4 years earlier, at my own 35th birthday, where he'd spent most of his toast talking about how well Bianca and Connor were doing, but I had never heard it delivered to 40 people with a microphone, framed as praise for one daughter and pity for the other. Marcus's hand found mine. He didn't say anything yet. He just held it tight, and I could feel him doing the same thing I was doing, counting, breathing, deciding what kind of response would actually matter versus what kind would just be noise. My father went on for another minute or so, working his way back to a toast for Bianca, and then he sat down to applause, and the party resumed its normal rhythm, and I excused myself to the bathroom inside the house and stood there for almost 4 minutes with my hands braced on the sink, breathing. When I came back out, Bianca found me near the bar. She looked uncomfortable in a way I rarely saw on her. Renata, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I didn't know he was going to say all that. I believed her. That's something I want to be clear about. Because this story isn't about Bianca being a villain. Bianca had spent her whole life being the easier child, the one who didn't push back. And she'd built a life that made our father comfortable in a way mine apparently didn't. And I don't think she'd ever fully understood the cost of that dynamic to me, partly because no one had ever said it to her directly. It's fine, I said, which wasn't true but is the thing you say. It's not fine, she said. He does this. He's done it before. I should have said something years ago. I didn't expect that. I looked at her. You've noticed? Of course I've noticed, she said. I'm not blind, Renata. She stopped. I didn't know how to fix it without making it weird. That conversation planted something I didn't fully understand the significance of yet. But I'll come back to that. About 40 minutes after my father's toast, after the cake had been cut, and people had mostly dispersed into smaller conversations around the pool, Connor's father, Bianca's father-in-law, a man named Edward Ashworth, who I'd met maybe 6 times over the years, picked up the abandoned microphone, mostly as a joke, to make a light-hearted comment about the band that was setting up. And in that loose, slightly drunk party atmosphere where people pass a microphone around, Marcus stood up. I didn't know he was going to do this. I want to be honest about that. I had no idea what he was about to say. And for a half second I felt a flash of panic. Because Marcus is not a confrontational person, and I worried he was about to do something that would embarrass us both. Can I say something? Just quickly, Marcus said, taking the mic from Edward with an easy smile, the same smile he uses with skeptical 17-year-olds on the first day of physics class. I just want to say something about my wife. The yard quieted, the way crowds do when they sense something is shifting. Vittorio said something earlier about Renata doing things the hard way, Marcus said, looking directly at my father, who was sitting near the pool with his wine glass, an expression of mild confusion starting to form. And he's right, actually. She does do things the hard way. She got her engineering degree while working 2 jobs, because her scholarship didn't cover everything. She spent 12 years making sure the buildings people work in don't collapse during earthquakes, which is a thing most of us never think about because she's good at her job. And about 14 months ago, she and I started a business together in our garage, building science equipment for classrooms. And I just want to share, because I think it's relevant, that the company did $12,000 in revenue last year, and we're on pace to clear $550,000 this year, and none of that happened by accident. It happened because Renata is one of the most disciplined, hard-working people I have ever known. I felt the blood leave my face. We had never told my father the numbers. We had barely told anyone the numbers. I'm not saying this to embarrass anyone, Marcus continued, and his voice was completely calm, no edge to it, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. I'm saying it because I've sat at enough family dinners listening to comments about my teaching salary and our little house, and tonight listening to Vittorio worry out loud about whether his daughter is taken care of in front of 40 people at his other daughter's birthday. I think it's worth saying clearly, Renata is taken care of. She always has been. She built that herself, alongside me, and I am unbelievably proud of her. And I think it's time someone said that out loud in this family, instead of letting the silence do the talking. The yard was completely silent except for the pool filter humming somewhere and someone's ice clinking in a glass. My father's face had gone through several colors. He set his wine glass down. I didn't mean, he started, but Marcus, still gently, still without raising his voice, said, I know you didn't mean it as cruelty, Vittorio. I really do. I think you say these things because somewhere along the way you decided that money is the same thing as care, and you've been measuring your daughters against that one yardstick for years without realizing what it costs them to hear it. He handed the microphone back to Edward. That's all. Sorry to interrupt the party. He sat back down next to me and took my hand again, and I was shaking. And Bianca, 3 seats away, had tears in her eyes, and my father sat very still with his hands in his lap, looking at the pool. What I learned over the following weeks was more complicated than I expected. And this is the part of the story that I think matters most, because it would have been easy for me to walk away from that party feeling completely vindicated and leave it there. But 3 days later, my father called me, and what he told me on that call reframed things I had believed about him for almost 20 years. He told me that when I was 19, the year my parents' flooring business had nearly gone under during the 2008 financial crisis, he and my mother had come within about 6 weeks of losing their house. He told me he had taken out a second mortgage, had drained almost all of his retirement savings, had worked 18-hour days for nearly 2 years to claw the business back from the edge. He told me that the experience had left him with a kind of fear about money that never fully went away, a conviction that financial precarity was the single most dangerous thing that could happen to a person, and that somewhere in the years afterward, watching me choose a teaching salaried husband and a modest house and what looked to him like a deliberately smaller life, he had projected all of that old fear onto me without ever examining it. I thought I was protecting you by worrying out loud, he said. I see now that it just sounded like I didn't think you'd done enough. That was never what I meant. I just never learned how to say the other thing. I don't think that excuses what he said at the party. I told him that clearly on the phone, but I also recognized, listening to him, a person who had built his entire understanding of safety around a trauma he'd never resolved, and who had been clumsily, painfully trying to express love through a framework that only knew how to talk about money. That doesn't erase the years of comments, but it explained them in a way that let me feel something closer to compassion than I expected to feel. Bianca and I talked more in the weeks after that, more honestly than we had in years. She told me she'd started pushing back on our father privately, telling him directly that his comments about Marcus and me needed to stop. She also told me something I hadn't known, that she and Connor had been going through their own quiet struggles, that the perfect life my father held up as the standard had included 2 years of marriage, counseling, and a miscarriage they'd never told the family about, and that being held up as the family's gold standard had its own particular loneliness to it. My father came to our house in August, on a Sunday by himself, which he had never done before. He sat at our kitchen table, the table Marcus had built himself, actually from reclaimed oak, and he apologized again, more specifically this time, naming actual comments he remembered making over the years. He asked about Pendulum Labs with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than comparison. He asked Marcus about his classroom, about the trebuchet project his students built every spring, in a way he never had before. It's been almost a year since Bianca's birthday. My father isn't a different person. Not entirely. Old patterns don't dissolve overnight, and there have been a few moments since where I've watched him catch himself mid-comment and visibly redirect. But he's trying, in a way I didn't think he was capable of before that party. Pendulum Labs cleared $612,000 in revenue this year. We bought the commercial unit outright in October. Marcus still teaches physics 5 days a week, still drives the Honda, still believes that some of the most important work in the world happens in a classroom for $78,000 a year, and I have never once, not for a single day, doubted that I was taken care of. What I think about most, looking back, isn't the speech my father gave that humiliated me, and it isn't even really the speech Marcus gave in response, as much as I'll always be grateful for it. What I think about is the 4 minutes I spent in Bianca's bathroom afterward, breathing, deciding not to make a scene, deciding to let the truth surface on its own time instead of forcing it. I think about how much of my life I'd spent absorbing my father's comparisons as fact instead of recognizing them as the fear of a man who never learned a different language for love. I learned that being taken care of doesn't always look like the thing other people expect it to look like. Sometimes it looks like a man who builds trebuchets for teenagers and quietly does the math on a kitchen table at night. Sometimes the people who measure your life against the wrong yardstick aren't doing it out of cruelty, but out of a fear so old they've forgotten where it came from. And sometimes the truest form of strength isn't standing up with a microphone. It's the quiet, deliberate work you do for years before anyone is paying attention. Work solid enough that when the truth finally does come out, it doesn't need defending. It just needs to be said.